Back when I was at my heaviest, I ran errands for the school beauty, Betty, just for an extra bite to eat. Everyone thought I was a sucker for her, laughing and saying I was a toad trying to eat swan meat. But I wasn't bothered. I still catered to her, running around doing her tasks. Later, she confessed her feelings to me, and I was shocked. So I switched schools immediately. At a class reunion, someone joked to Betty that she's finally free of the chubby guy's harassment. And if the ugly dude shows up, what did she say? Betty replied, "I'd tell him I have a chef's certificate, and my cooking is pretty great. And he's not ugly, nor was I harassed. Here's my meal card. Remember to grab lunch for me. I don't eat eggplants." Betty said this casually, tossing the meal card to me. I caught it in a frenzy, eyes wide and face glowing with evident happiness. Betty chuckled slightly and left. Every time I'd buy food for Betty, I'd have to use my meal card. Then she'd repay me later. Last time, I didn't have enough money and ended up getting the cheapest eggplants. Seeing the eggplant made her face turn green, and she let me have her meal for free, but she still paid me back. Being her gopher was pure coincidence. One day, I had no money for lunch and was starving. Sitting in the cafeteria, my eyes fixated on everyone's food glowing green with envy. Just then, Betty finished her meal and left, and I mustered the courage to eat her leftovers. She caught me as she returned to fetch her headphones. Awkwardly, I mumbled, "I'll pay you back for the meal." Her expression shifted slightly. I guess she was mad, but she said, "Get my meals every day," and handed me $100. Initially, I didn't get what she meant. Later, I realized she was hiring me. But rumors spread, saying I was trying to overreach, taking advantage of the school beauty's kindness. I understood why people talked. I was chubby, had average grades, even had a nickname. Anyone would think I was dreaming beyond my reach. But I had no delusions about Betty. I just wanted to eat enough to survive. Being fat is fine. But when I don't eat, it feels like my stomach is burning with acid. It's really painful. At lunchtime, Betty didn't eat or show up in the cafeteria. I ate her meal, stuffed to the brim but strangely satisfied. Suddenly, a bowl of hot soup poured over my head. Laughter erupted around me. Look at him. Isn't he like a pig? So ugly. Disgusting. I raised my head and wiped the soup from my face. Thankfully, it wasn't that hot. My skin just turned a bit red. I didn't fight back because I couldn't afford to. Someone pushed me, and I nearly fell. "Peter, you're so ugly. How dare you hang around Betty?" They threw rice balls at me, leaving my uniform a mess. I oddly thought, what a waste of food. That afternoon, I made a rare early trip home to change clothes. Betty, who's a neat freak, wouldn't have put up with any dirt. Dad saw me and scowled deeply. "You lousy kid. Where have you been? You're filthy." I ducked my head and hurried to my room. Then came the loud knocking on my door. I didn't open it, so Dad kicked it. "Such a nuisance. I can't believe I raised you, you eyesore. You're so fat. There's no allowance next week. You need to lose weight." I closed my eyes, the words ringing in my ears like nails on a chalkboard. Finally, Dad stopped, no more kicking the door. I quickly changed and went back to school. The English teacher looked at me impatiently. "Stand outside. Did you get permission from me?" I opened my mouth to explain I got permission from our main teacher, but then decided to drop it. I turned and stood at the door, with talks buzzing inside the classroom, irking me. Suddenly, the English teacher shouted, "Betty, what are you doing? Go stand outside too." Betty put down her book and walked to my side. She had defiantly torn up her textbook, making a scene. "Where'd you go at noon?" "Went home to change clothes." I told the truth without ratting anyone out because it wasn't Betty's problem. That afternoon, though, she scolded everyone. Parents were called. Students lined up to apologize to me. Her dad was a buddy of the school board chair, making the student dispute pretty significant. I was bewildered, repeatedly thanking Betty and saying it was okay, that I didn't care what they said. That minor bullying was no more than a scratch to me. Betty replied, "I didn't help you out of goodwill. You didn't bring me water because of them." I sighed in relief, grinning slightly still. "Thank you." After that, They only dared whisper but didn't openly bully me. That evening, Betty bought me barbecue before I went home. Inside, there was a pair of unfamiliar women's shoes. As soon as I got in, my dad shoved me impatiently. Back this late? Hurry up. Get water. After fetching water, I found out Dad was getting married. He was all smiles, hugging the woman, not noticing my full body tremors. I knew the woman. She's Dad's friend and my childhood nightmare. I wasn't this heavy when I was little, and she always hugged me with her unpleasant breath. If I struggled, Dad scorned me for being ungrateful, saying the lady only played with me because she liked me. I felt uneasy about her gaze even back then. Quietly, I returned to my room, Dad yelling outside. That brat showing me attitude. Would I be struggling without you? The woman held him back, trying to soothe him. Forget it. He's just a child. A child? All he ever does is eat. And he's saying he's depressed. What depressed kid's living so well? Why does he do this? I buried my face in the covers, feeling empty, my whole body stiff. I wondered if I jumped from the balcony, would Dad feel guilty seeing my decaying corpse? I got up from the bed and opened the window. The wind howled outside, and I surprisingly felt no fear. Suddenly, my special notification tone buzzed. I stumbled away from the window, reaching for my phone. Come out, buy me a bottle of water. I got dressed quickly and dashed downstairs. As soon as I looked up, I saw Betty standing there. A bit of panic crept into my heart. Did she see me just now? I live on the 7th floor, and the bedroom light was on. Did she see? I had so many questions bubbling inside, but I had to push them down. Betty came up to me, her eyebrows slightly furrowed. Come with me. Betty played basketball with her friends while I bought a case of water and sat nearby, watching. Her friends laughed and said something to Betty. I didn't catch it. Then she lightly scolded them back. Dad hasn't been home for weeks, let alone given me any money. How am I supposed to live? Survive? He doesn't care. He might think it's good for me to go hungry since I'm so overweight anyway. But my meds are running out. I finally couldn't hold it in and asked Betty to lend me money. Really? I'll pay you back later, I promised, looking at her with big, hopeful eyes. Betty lowered her head. What do you need the money for? It's important. A slight hint of amusement flickered in Betty's eyes. What's important? If you don't tell me, you're not getting it. Betty makes sure I eat, but she never gives me extra money. She says I'd go down the wrong path if I had money. To buy medicine. Without another word, Betty handed over the money. I counted it. It was almost 1,000. Betty found out I had depression accidentally when I had an episode at school and she saw me. Tears uncontrollably streamed down my face. My eyes were red, and I was shaking all over. She came over, her tone casual. You should take your meds. Betty hugged me. It's okay. You're just sick. Betty's voice was soothing, inexplicably calming. It was the first time someone comforted me like that, and I really wanted to ask how she knew it was depression. But in the end, I didn't. After buying the meds, I returned the extra money to Betty. She glanced at the money and softly said, "Good job." My face instantly turned red. My heart felt like it was wrapped in something sweet. Betty didn't look at me after that. She focused on the book in front of her. I couldn't understand the language. Maybe it was German. During the afternoon gym class, the teacher let us play around freely. I sat on the stone bench, and suddenly there was a commotion. I stretched my neck to look. Betty, I like you. Turns out it was the school's popular guy confessing to Betty. Lots of people joined in the teasing, and surprisingly, even the gym teacher didn't stop it and joined in the fun. Betty's eyebrows slightly furrowed. I was the only one who noticed she seemed a bit annoyed. He was the heartthrob of the school. She was even more popular. Everyone thought they'd make a great pair. I rested my chin on my hand, wishing Betty the best partner. The heartthrob was quite handsome, did well in his studies, and had a good personality. He even stood up for me once when others were mean. Through the crowd, she suddenly glanced at me, and our eyes met. A sudden warmth rose up. I quickly lowered my head as the bell signaled the end of recess. I walked away. A strange emptiness filled my heart, one I couldn't explain. Will I need to get Betty lunch from now on? I wondered aimlessly. Back in class, students trickled in, and someone brought up the confession scene from earlier. She rejected him. Can you believe it? If the heartthrob confessed to me, I'd be overjoyed, someone exclaimed. I froze. The pen in my hand rolled to the floor. In the next moment, Betty picked up the black pen. What are you thinking about? I asked awkwardly. Why did you turn him down? Many eyes were on Betty. They too wanted to know why. Oliver's good looks, grades, family background, personality, he's got it all. Why reject him? Betty frowned slightly at my question. Focus on your studies? Why think about romance? I forgot. Betty is like a celestial being, uninterested in worldly affairs. The heartthrob gave up pursuing Betty gracefully. Admirable. I envied him, he was so cool about it. On top of that, he bought me a cup of bubble tea and winked. You're awesome, you must have what I don't. I didn't get it and looked confusedly at Betty. Like it? If not, just toss it, Betty said. I hurriedly hugged the bubble tea, whispering, the heartthrob bought this for me. Betty scoffed, don't get fixated just because they're good looking. But he is handsome, I countered. At the school performance, the heartthrob signed up to dance. As I watched him dance on stage, I couldn't tear my eyes away. Sneaking a glance at Betty beside me, I suddenly felt like losing weight. I stood 6'3" and weighed over 160 pounds. At this age, I was undeniably chubby. Betty handed me an open bag of chips. Want some? I resisted the urge to grab them. No, thanks. Honestly, most of the time I couldn't resist eating. Betty frowned. Don't be picky. We're out of barbecue flavor. Still, I didn't take any. Before the heartthrob's performance, I unexpectedly got a call from Dad, asking me to come home. I kept nodding as the door behind me swung open. The heartthrob smiled subtly at me. Peter, Betty wants to talk to you. Instinctively, I hung up, and before I could ask anything, he left, closing the door behind him. Betty stood there holding roses. My ears felt hot, eyes burning from the color. Betty looked intently at me, her throat moving slightly. Peter, I like you. I rubbed my hands and instinctively stepped back, palms sweating. Betty's eyes were bright, like starlight, so beautiful. Yet, I lowered my head. Sorry, I don't like you. Betty's face fell instantly. Why? What's wrong with me? It's not you. It's me. Didn't you say to focus on studies and not think about romance yet? Betty paused, then laughed. Fine. Let's wait until after the college entrance exams. I averted my eyes, nerves in chaos, nodding hastily. Betty seemed relieved, just glad I didn't reject her entirely. She put her arm around my shoulder, making me tingle all over. The heartthrob's performance had started. Everyone was drawn to this handsome, talented guy. Handsome and exceptional. These words didn't apply to me at all. Why would Betty like me? I'm plain, overweight, and my grades aren't stellar. I dared not ask why, thinking maybe Betty was just going through a phase. Like Oliver? Betty asked me quietly, looking down. I nodded. Nobody dislikes him. You're great too, really talented. Don't be jealous of him. Betty's eyes were so bright it was scary. I looked away, embarrassed. After night class ended, I headed home. Dad and my stepmom had already packed the suitcases. Peter, why don't you listen? I told you to come home right away, why don't you obey? With grades like yours, what good college could you get into? Might as well drop out and work early. I clutched my backpack, staying silent. Dad got so mad, he wanted to hit me. Stepmom stopped him. All right, let's go now, we won't be late. Dad instantly beamed. You're the only kind-hearted one, not minding this kid. On the train, I blocked and deleted everyone, including Betty. I'm sorry, really sorry. You deserve someone better. Stepmom was generous, giving me a lot of pocket money, which I saved up and gave to Betty. I memorized her bank account number by heart, a farewell gift to my youth. When Dad found out I spent it all, he beat me, leaving my face bruised and swollen. While Stepmom tried to calm him down, she pulled me up from the floor. In the middle of the night, Stepmom sneaked into my room. She said, Peter, It's tough for me to work, and we're short on money. Could you help? I hugged myself, wary. How? This is my son's card. He's a doctor. You're young, it'll be okay no matter what. I felt myself pale as her voice droned on. One pill can be worth thousands, and it won't affect you much. I agreed. Stepmom left feeling assured. I grabbed my light bag, my ID, and quietly left home. Bought a ticket and started my first job. After I left, Dad called me countless times, but I didn't answer. Changed my number, and now no one can find me. I need to live for myself, I want to live well. 7 years passed, and I finally saved enough to buy a small shop. Upstairs, there's a loft where I can sleep comfortably. No more monthly rent to pay. That day, I was binging shows at the register. An old classmate, Mike, saw a photo on the desk and recognized me immediately. Hey boss, don't you know this guy? I looked up and recognized Mike, the one who used to bully me in the cafeteria. I smiled. It's me, is there a problem? Mike scanned me in disbelief. Peter, how did you get so thin? I looked at myself. After losing weight and working so hard, I had really shaped up. It made sense they couldn't recognize me. Mike seemed to forget the past. He sat down to chat. What college did you get into? You know, the school beauty got into the top C university? Hearing about Betty brought a smile to my face. Didn't go to college. Mike blurted out, figures, you never had great grades. Then he gave a sheepish laugh. He added my contact and said, next week we have a class reunion. Make sure to come. He grabbed a carton of milk, ready to head out. I stopped him, pay up. Mike forced a smile, we're old classmates. Pay up. I reiterated with a smile. Reluctantly, he paid $90. Mumbling, he left. So stingy, no wonder you didn't get into college. I kept smiling silently. Words like those couldn't hurt me this much anymore. No interest in the reunion, but I did mean to visit my hometown and pay back the stepmom. It's not a lot, maybe just $3,000. Abandoned, but still legally married. She lived alone in a small rented room, surviving off my dad's leftover money. Returned to the unfamiliar city, it felt a bit surreal. Dad saw me and didn't recognize me. He aged a lot, the light in his eyes long gone. I gave him the money, pleasantly surprising him. Why are you suddenly giving me money? He thought I was a stranger. Can't spend it all. I replied coldly. Smiling widely, he held my hand. If only my son were like you, the son I raised just left his own father behind. He ranted to me, the stranger, for over 10 minutes. I didn't react at all, realizing how much he hated me. Why have me if you hate me so? After saying goodbye, I sat by the curb, watching the passing cars, bored. A Maybach suddenly parked in front of me, blocking my view. Then came the sharp, screeching honk. Annoyed, I stood to see who it was. The window rolled down, revealing a face I've never forgotten. Betty looked cold. Get in. Blankly, I stared, never imagining I'd meet her like this again. Dumbstruck. Get in. Suppressing anxiety, I tried to be natural, entering the car. The cabin smelled nice, but my back was sweaty. My mind kept racing. How did Betty recognize me? I'm completely different now compared to before. Where are you staying now? I mentioned a hotel. When we got there, I barely unbuckled before trying to leave. Betty grabbed my wrist. My heart pounded. I didn't dare look at her, thinking she'd say something. Even if she cursed or hit me, I'd take it. I was the ungrateful one, not deserving her. Then she smiled gently, you've lost weight. My heart fluttered, and I forced a smile. I was too chubby before. Betty let go and I escaped the car. Behind me, I felt her gaze, intense and focused. On the steps, I nearly tripped. Facing her, I couldn't stay calm. Back at the hotel, I took a shower and sprawled out on the bed. I started thinking about the class reunion. Suddenly, I wanted to go. Betty might be there. But what would it matter? 7 years had passed. I pulled the blanket over me, thinking maybe it's not worth it. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. It was a friend request. Seeing the profile picture made my heart race again. Betty still hadn't changed it, just a plain black photo. I hesitated, then another message came in. Accepted already. I know you're awake. Hands trembling, I hit accept. Immediately another message popped up. Come down. I brought you water. I used to bring Betty water. Now it was the other way around. For a moment, I felt dazed, like I was dreaming. I ran to the window and saw Betty downstairs. Behind her, a car parked in the same spot as before. Had she been there all along? I didn't hesitate. I slipped on my sandals and headed downstairs. I knew Betty had a temper, but halfway down, I wondered why I should be afraid of her now. That thought hadn't fully settled before I stood in front of Betty. She handed me a bottle of juice. It was the sweet kind I used to love, borderline toothache sweet. After I got better, I didn't like it as much anymore. Too sweet for my taste. I took it and said, thanks. Peter, make sure you come to the reunion. I finally realized where she'd gotten my contact info. From Mike. Betty glanced at the juice. Not drinking it. I admitted, not a fan of it anymore. Betty hesitated, like she wanted to ask if I didn't like her anymore. But the words changed. Sorry, I didn't know. I was suddenly at a loss for words. We just stood there for a minute. Betty waved her hand. Go back up. I'm leaving. I stood there, watching her walk away. I suddenly remembered I hadn't said goodbye when I left. Leaving without a word was too much. I went to the reunion after all. I'd arrived long before it started, but didn't have the guts to face everyone. I hid alone in the bathroom. After a lot of mental preparation, I finally stepped out. Through the door crack, I saw them, seemingly laughing. Hey, school queen, where you working now? Betty answered with a low voice. Family business. And you, school king? Oliver laughed. Not as impressive as Betty. I'm a dance teacher now. Isn't that great? You both make a perfect couple. Mike chimed in, oh, Peter's coming soon. He's changed so much. I almost didn't recognize him. Someone else added, how much could he have changed? Still the ugly duckling, I bet. I clenched my fists, palms sweaty. But, hey, at least the school queen doesn't have to deal with that fat guy anymore. What'll you say when that ugly guy shows up? They smugly assumed Betty would cringe at Peter, would join in mocking him. Betty spoke up. I'll say I'm certified as a top-level chef and can cook really well. Also, he's not ugly, and he didn't harass me. I've always liked him. The room went silent, disbelief hanging in the air. Impossible, right? How could someone as outstanding as Betty like someone as ordinary as Peter? I subconsciously stepped back, heart pounding like crazy. Betty suddenly turned her head, locking eyes with mine. She smiled. Why are you still standing at the door? Come on in. I had no chance to back out. Betty came and pulled the door open. All eyes on me made me feel like pins were sticking into my back. Betty held my hand firmly. Peter, I'm walking towards you again. Stop backing away. I sat next to Betty, silence enveloping us all. Oliver tried to lighten the mood. Wow, Peter, you turned out really handsome. The room seemed to wake up from a trance after his words. I had changed, turned into someone quite handsome, attracting lots of attention. Everyone's obsessed with looks these days. Peter, you've become so good-looking after losing weight. Didn't go under the knife, did you? Malice never quite fades away. Betty added, those with bad genes always presume the same about others. The guy's face twisted, and he didn't dare to speak again. The topic shifted away from me, but curious glances lingered. They started comparing, chit-chatting, the conversation inevitably circling back to money. So typical, and I'm no exception. Oliver leaned in and whispered, Peter, you like her, don't you? Be brave, it's no shame to like someone. I stared at him, dazed. There was a hint of disappointment in Oliver's eyes. I know she doesn't like me, but I can't help it. You clearly have something special? Or why else would Betty like you so much? I left in haste, frustrated. He had noticed. Was I that obvious? So that milk tea was a hint. When Oliver confessed to Betty, she didn't spare him a glance, just focused on me. He knew it that day. Even the most perfect appearance won't make everyone adore you. Betty chased after me. Outside, a light rain fell, cool against my skin. She followed me slowly, even though she had a car. She was stubborn. Peter, stop. I can't keep up. I paused, obediently stopping. Betty hugged me tightly, warmth washing over me. Her breath on my chest sent a shiver down my spine. Peter, don't be afraid. Don't be. Okay? I closed my eyes as tears fell. I'm sorry. I've let you down for so long. Betty whispered in my ear. I'll always be here for you. I have depression. It might come back any time. I'm not brilliant, not handsome, and honestly pretty boring. I listed my flaws, but Betty's simple "I like you" stopped me cold. I like you. Betty still looked at me intently. No matter what, still liking me. I understood Betty's message. Why? I asked. I don't know. I just do. Liked you from the very start. Her bad temper and OCD didn't matter when it came to Peter. She had enough patience to help him face himself. Even when he said he didn't like her, she still didn't believe it. Eyes don't lie. Betty held my face, our foreheads touching. As the rain outside got heavier, I gave her a little push. Go back quickly, or you'll catch a cold. A hint of disappointment flashed in Betty's eyes as she insisted on walking me back. I agreed. Betty suddenly mentioned something small. The stray cat you used to feed. I adopted it. It's so fat now. Wanna come see it? Betty looked at me expectantly. The stray cat was a big orange tabby. I had fed it throughout high school. Later, I found out it had two owners, me and Betty. It fooled us both enough that we willingly fed it. Such a sneaky cat. Sure, I'd love to see it. The car turned, and Betty drove towards her place. Betty's home was very clean, nothing scattered around, but it felt a bit too empty. As soon as we got back, the orange tabby came over, rubbing against us like we hadn't been apart for 7 years. What do you think? Still like it? Betty looked at me eagerly, as if asking if I still liked her. I squatted down to pet the orange tabby, nodding under her gaze. Betty and I were together. She kissed me, her lips and tongue heated, almost overwhelming. She hugged me tight. You've lost weight, way too thin. Betty was almost in tears with concern. I had lost weight, a bit underweight actually, but still within normal range. Can I cook for you? From now on, it'll be my responsibility. Okay. I smiled and answered her. I stayed over at Betty's, the two of us lying in the same bed. The orange tabby occasionally came over, rubbing against us. Staring at the ceiling, Betty spoke softly. Don't be afraid. My mom had depression too. It's no big deal. I propped myself up, looking at her. How is your mom now? Betty managed to smile. She passed away. I took a sharp breath, lifting my hand to brush her face. No wonder she could tell I was depressed. Betty held my hand, gently brushing her cheek against it. She took her own life. I stopped her countless times, but then she cried and asked if she didn't have the right to die. She did, so Betty let her. Betty stopped preventing her, watching helplessly as she went towards death. That's why her dad hated her, blamed her for her mother's death. But wasn't he the one who drove her to it? If he hadn't cheated during the pregnancy, if he hadn't angered her grandpa into dying, she wouldn't have lost her mom. Betty looked down at me. Don't leave me. I know I'm selfish. What she didn't say was that in high school, she saw Peter standing at the window, nearly falling over. She was almost scared out of her mind. I laughed. Betty, I don't want to die. I've always been reaching out for help. I don't even need meds anymore. Betty wasn't the only one I reached out to, but the only one who reached out back. In a voice tinged with amusement, Betty said, You're as courageous as my mom. Life or death, two choices, both brave. I held Betty's hand, determined to live for life, not death. I returned to the small town, opened my shop's doors. Oliver had sent me several photos, all of his dance moves. So cool. Which one looks best? I replied seriously. They all look great. Oliver called me, joking about himself. He said, I thought I was going to be a famous dancer, but here I am, teaching kids at a dance studio. Oliver came from a middle-class family. Our classmates thought he had it easy, but he didn't really. Betty, though, was truly an heiress. Isn't that great? You love dancing, and you were our school's heartthrob. Oliver laughed heartily. But I'm nothing compared to you. I chuckled, not exactly agreeing. Oliver was still the proud genius from my youth. I always dreamed of being a prince like him. Are you and Betty together? Oliver suddenly asked. I was a bit taken aback, but answered truthfully, "Yeah, we are. After all these years, I still like her." Oliver seemed relieved. "Finally, I can let it go." Oliver told me that after I disappeared, Betty searched for me for a long time. Eventually, she found out I had deactivated my number, and she couldn't track me down. She changed a lot, laughed less. Her desk partner was never anyone else after me. Betty kept my seat reserved for me. Others thought the class beauty was just sentimental, but Oliver knew Betty liked Peter. In a time when everyone cared about appearances, Betty only liked Peter for who he was. Oliver was truly envious. He envied how someone could like another person so much. He figured he'd never encounter that. Hanging up, I stared at the ledger for a long time, lost in thought. Betty had walked alone for a very long time. She genuinely, earnestly liked me. That weekend, I was stocking the shelves alone, when a woman stood at the door, holding a bouquet of roses, hesitating to come in. I smiled, asking, "Can I help you with something?" Her face flushed. She handed me the flowers. "Hi, Peter. I like you." I was taken aback for a moment. "What?" The woman kept repeating, "Peter, I really like you. I'm about 5 feet 3 inches, have an apartment, and own a car. The place has a mortgage and I've got a clean dating history. I make around $12,000 a month, but I'll keep working hard. I'm truly into you. I've been watching you for a while." I don't even recognize her. "Sorry, I..." Before I could finish, she hurriedly said, "Don't rush to turn me down. I've bought lots of stuff from you. Have you really forgotten me? A lot of people come here to shop. It's a pretty busy place. I also run a package station next door, but the store space is rented. Customers often pick up packages and buy stuff at the same time." I was just about to decline her when I heard a woman's voice behind me. "Sorry, but he has a girlfriend." The woman turned around and saw Betty, who exuded confidence. She turned a bit pale, clutching her roses, and left in a hurry. Betty smiled at me. "You've got quite the charm." "Huh?" I felt a bit awkward inside. Is this really charming? With a strong survival instinct, I said, "I only like you." Betty was overjoyed. She asked me out, bought roses, gave gifts, and we even had a meal together. There isn't much time with Betty. Her father is always looming over her. She gave me a quick kiss and said, "One day, I'm going to overthrow him." I stood at the airport waving goodbye to her. Betty traveled a lot, and we eventually got caught by her dad. I found myself sitting face to face with Betty's father. He had a stack of papers in front of him, all about me. "Leave her. Do you even know who Betty is? Only a husband of equal status can help her." I studied the man, noting how much he resembled Betty. I kept a straight face and asked, "Are you the reason Betty doesn't have a mom?" His face twisted, looking quite upset. "Peter," he warned in a low voice, calmly said, "Don't rush. You wouldn't want to lose another daughter, would you? She loves me. As her father, you should know it well." He forced a smile. "Love and all that fades over time. But she waited for me for 7 years. He attempted to intimidate me again. Then I slid my phone in front of him. It was a call with Betty. He seemed flustered. Through gritted teeth, he said, "Peter, you played me." I tapped the table, reminding him, "Your daughter's on the line." Betty glared at her father, her voice cold. "Dad, are you trying to make things worse?" He stood up, struggling with the situation. "I'm your dad, and I'm doing this for your own good." Betty shot him a frosty look until he couldn't hold it anymore. "Betty, you know what's truly right. Peter is the best." And from the phone, Betty's voice repeated, "Peter is the best." I hung up, looking at the silent standoff. Betty's father eventually backed down. He lost his grip. He couldn't control Betty anymore. She's grown up, no longer a teenager. In a cold voice, her dad said, "Don't regret this. Depression is a mental illness. There's no happy ending in that." Betty retorted, "According to you, Dad, you're not doing so well yourself." Defeated, he stormed out. Betty hugged me, flustered, "Peter, don't listen to him." I smiled and shook my head. "I'm not stupid." Betty's taken 100 steps toward me. It's my turn to take the 101st step. She tilted her face upward to kiss me. "What I'm saying is true. You're the best." And in my heart, I echoed, you are the best too. All these years, I've only had feelings for you.